Will you pray with me? Holy and loving God, we give you thanks for this opportunity to be together this morning as your people. As we lift up the words of your story, our story, we ask that the thoughts that we share, the things that we ponder, the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, because you, God, are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Our story today begins just after Jesus feeds the crowd of 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He has asked the disciples to go ahead of him to the other side of the water so he can dismiss the crowds by himself and spend a little time alone in prayer. He comes back to find the boat has been pushed out far from the land by the choppy waters and the strong wind. And meanwhile, out in the middle of those choppy waters, the disciples are all weathering the storm together on that boat. It's early in the morning now, and I imagine daylight is just starting to break when the disciples see a strange figure walking toward them on the water. Terrified, they begin to shout, "It's a ghost!" And immediately, Jesus calls to them saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." But the disciples are unable to recognize Jesus. They can't tell that it's him coming towards them. So Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out of the water and walk with you." "Come," Jesus responds. So Peter steps out of the boat and begins walking on the water toward Jesus. Now, I grew up in the who isn't on Ritalin era. Many of my friends and my classmates were diagnosed or misdiagnosed, as the case may be, with attention deficit disorder or ADHD. And as such, my junior high and high schools were riddled with kids on one stimulant or another, prescribed or otherwise. For better or worse, it was kind of a fact of life for kids in the 90s and early 2000s. That was just simply part of our culture. And I tell you this only so that you don't think I'm being entirely insensitive to those who have genuine diagnoses with ADD or ADHD. When I tell you that my high school youth group, when I was in high school, referred to Peter as the ADD disciple. Based on our limited understanding of the disorder, we believed that Peter, yes, Peter, one of the leaders of the early church, keeper of the keys to the pearly gates, would probably be a good candidate for medication. Believe it or not, we came to this conclusion during Bible study. We had put a lot of thought into this. And frankly, I'm not entirely sure we're that far off. Throughout the Gospels, Peter is pretty impulsive, and his impulsivity seems to get the best of him sometimes. He's quick. He's the first to draw his knife against the soldiers that come to arrest Jesus after he had been betrayed in the garden. He's the first to assert that he will not deny Jesus. He will never deny Jesus once he has been arrested, and then proceeds to do exactly that. And in this story, he's quick to step out of a boat in the middle of a storm to walk on water. Now, I know there's much more to ADD or ADHD than simply being impulsive. But we figured that if Peter's parents had pulled the old, "If Bartholomew jumped off the temple, would you?" they probably wouldn't hear the answer, because Peter would be halfway up the temple with Bart by the time they finished asking. Since that night in Bible study, Peter has been at the top of my list of favorite disciples. And today's story highlights why. Peter is willing to test the promises of Jesus by taking bold and sometimes risky steps so that he might deepen his faith and come to recognize Jesus in a more profound way. In today's story, Peter acts as though he's never seen Jesus do incredible things before. He's just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people with one kid's lunchbox. He's seen Jesus drive out demons. He's seen Jesus heal the sick. And he has seen Jesus bring a girl back from the dead. But he just doesn't quite recognize that it's Jesus walking towards him on the water. That's just something Jesus could never do, right? After having seen Jesus do all that, why then are the disciples still unable to recognize him? There are two major cultural ideas at play in the story that are being used to help set the scene, and will give us a broader metaphorical kind of context for what happens later. And here they are. Water is scary, and evil is real. First, water is scary. In Hebraic thought, water is more than just a physical reality. Water also poses certain metaphysical threats to human existence. A sea can be so deep that it's impossible to know what's at the bottom. A river can run so rapidly that it can uproot trees and move houses off their foundations. And a flood can be so severe that it can wipe out an entire civilization before it subsides. This notion is present throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. In the early creation story, in the first creation story, God spends an entire day separating the waters of the earth from the waters of the sky. God then spends another half day separating those waters on earth so that dry land could appear. In contrast, it only took God one day to create humans. And sometimes when I think about that, I wonder, based on the plight of our world, if God sometimes wished there wouldn't have been a little bit more time put into that. Karl Barth talks about the water in the first creation story as that which in its abundance and power is absolutely opposed to God's creation. Recall that the waters of the flood in the story of Noah wiped out the earth. The waters of the Red Sea blocked the escape of the Hebrew people trying to rid themselves of Pharaoh's oppression. And the waters of the Jordan separated the people of God from the Holy Land. In each case, water, while ultimately controlled by God, is that which stands between the people and God. Water, Barth continues, is representative of all the evil powers which oppress and resist the salvation intended for the people of Israel. Suffice it to say, being stuck in the middle of turbulent waters was, at the very least, uncomfortable and probably more than a little disconcerting. Second, evil is real. The cultural understanding of the day was that the cosmic battle between God and evil, between good and evil, was literally real and was taking place in the physical world. Demons and evil spirits were part of everyday life. Tie this to the water is the representation of all evil, and it's easy to see how they might mistake Jesus for a ghost. It's Jesus, not the storm itself, that terrifies them. Maybe it's a combination of the two. All this may seem a bit dramatic to our modern sensibilities, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves. Would we recognize God walking toward us? Our cultural understanding is based on peer-reviewed scholarship, empirical evidence, data. And a man, as far as those things are concerned, last time I checked, cannot walk on water. So we cannot assume we would have recognized God walking on water either. Would we be so bold as to ask God, ask that figure walking toward us, to command us out of the boat so that we might do something amazing? More importantly, would we actually get out of the boat? Most days, my best answer to those questions would be, maybe. Who am I to step out in a grand gesture of faith when I'm no better than the next guy? Why would I want to risk looking foolish, risking drowning, when if I just wait long enough, somebody else is bound to do it first. No matter how much I would like to think that I would follow his example, to do what Peter did takes more than just a propensity for impulsivity. It takes more than a potential need for medication. It takes serious guts and a lot of faith. Now, it may seem that the gospel and I disagree on this point, but we'll come back to that. Rarely do I, as a disciple, aside from the children's message last week, feel compelled to walk on water. But I imagine we have all at one time or another felt called to step out of our comfort zone, to do something that, while probably more mundane than Peter's feat, felt almost as frightening. For me, one of those steps was leaving the ordination process. I was taking a huge, huge risk. I had spent almost half of my life in the church that I was going to be ordained. I had learned a lot. I was doing a lot. But it just didn't feel right. I was taking a huge risk and knew very little about what was ahead of me at the time. But I could not shake the feeling that the call I had to leave the church was just as strong, if not stronger, than the call I felt to enter the ordination process in the first place. So after months of thought and prayer, I stepped out of the boat and walked away. Not every step is that large. On any given day, God calls us to take any number of small steps to test and deepen our faith. But sometimes God calls us to do something completely out of routine. And despite how risky or impulsive it might feel, somewhere deep in your gut, you know that it's the right thing to do. But how often do we pass on these opportunities because we would rather stay in the comfort and safety of the boat? Staying in the boat is not what we are called to do. It's not what God calls us, wants us, compels us to do. God calls us to step out even in the midst of stormy seas. And if we are to be faithful to the call of Christ, we must muster up the courage to take that step. Does this guarantee that we'll have calm waters? Absolutely not. We will be faced with storms and rough waters, but that's not the point. The point is that in spite of that, we need to step out. We need to step out and test our faith. It means that we are not to be satisfied with the comfort of the boat. It means that we want our faith to be a dive in the deep end, not just a swim in the kiddie pool. That is why Peter got out of the boat. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out of the boat, to come out onto the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he called out to him, saying, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand, caught him, and said, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" Now, I, like many of you, grew up on at least occasion hearing those words from Jesus as being less of a comfort and more of a scolding. "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" Now, heard this way, we might assume that our call, then, is to be better than Peter. To push ourselves out of the boat toward a big and boastful faith so that we can succeed where Peter failed. But I don't think Jesus is questioning the size of Peter's faith. Later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Again, in the story that precedes this one, Jesus was able to feed 5,000 people with one kid's lunch. What Jesus is questioning is not the size of Peter's faith. It's Peter's ability to trust that what he knows to be true. That God does not and will not abandon us. Peter may have had only a little faith, but nobody else got out of that boat. Peter did what no one else was willing to do. And he did so not because he's impulsive, but because he has faith. As disciples, we are called to follow Peter's example and be willing to step out of the comfort and security of the boat and head into troubled waters of the world to proclaim the love, mercy, and justice of God that we find in the promises of Christ. And we are called to do so regardless of how little our faith may feel or be. In his sermon, How Will You Know If It's Jesus?, William Willimon puts it like this. If Peter had not ventured forth, had not obeyed the call to walk on water, then Peter would have never had this great opportunity for recognition of Jesus and rescue by Jesus. I wonder too, says Willimon, if many of us are merely splashing about in the safe shallows and therefore have too few opportunities to test and deepen our faith. The story today implies if you want to be close to Jesus, you have to venture forth out on the sea. You have to prove his promises through trusting his promises, through risk and venture. Stepping out of the boat will probably feel risky. It will probably feel uncomfortable or scary or maybe even impulsive. But staying in the boat will not feel like much at all. So we have to ask ourselves, are we content to stay in the boat, to splash about in the shallows, safe and secure, while knowingly passing on opportunities to deepen our faith, to grow in our call? Or are we ready to step off the boat for a walk on the water, knowing that God is already there, ready to pull us back into the boat when we need it most? I think we're ready. So let's be bold. Let's step off the boat confidently and with faith, knowing that we are never abandoned by God. Amen.